Our next guest is Frank Ettawageshik. Frank lives in Harbor Springs, Michigan, with his wife, Rochelle. He served in tribal elected office for 16 years, 14 of those 16 years as a tribal chairman of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Harbor Springs, Michigan. During his tenure as tribal chairman, he was instrumental in adopting the Tribal and First Nations Great Lake Water Accord in 2004 and the United League of Indigenous Nations Treaty in 2007. Recently, he was appointed Tribal Court Appellate Justice for his tribe. And since 2009, Frank has been serving as Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan. He also serves on the Michigan Water Use Advisory Council and on the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. Beyond his community, he has represented the National Congress of American Indians at several meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from Paris onwards. And he has participated in many meetings of the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva as well. So Frank, it's very nice to see you. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas, some of which we might have discussed far too late at night in Madrid last year. So Ghazali?
Yeah, Frank, thank you so much for being with us. I hope you're well. I hope you're safe. I hope the nation is doing well. Okay. Well, like Tomo said, we have many late night discussions, brainstorming sessions between yourself, Frank, me, and Tomo about like negotiations, diplomacy, and governance. You have. So let me jump in right in with a question. You have observed, not only observed, but also participated in the negotiation process leading up to the platform at the UNFCCC, so the Climate Change Convention. What is the biggest challenge that you have seen, or on the other hand, what is there something that you've seen that impresses you? Could be from a state side, indigenous side. What comes to mind?
Well, first of all, it's really nice to be talking with you when I'm awake. Just to let you know, and I do appreciate the opportunity to be online here, and thank you, Tomo, for the great introduction. I guess the biggest thing that I see from those negotiations was the first of all, the creation of the acknowledgement of indigenous thought and existence within the Paris Accord in several different places, but particularly in the platform that led to the development of the Facilitative Working Group, which is for the first time in history, indigenous representatives that are selected by indigenous people are sitting as equals at a table with representatives from the various nation states of the UN. And this is an incredible accomplishment. You know, it seems like some people will see, well, it just happened. And those people who see it happening right now think that's the way it's always been, but it hasn't been that way. We couldn't even get in the room for years and years and years. And now we're not only in the room, but we're at the table. And so even though that's just one place, this is an extremely important development. I think a drawback that I see to this whole thing is that it's pretty easy to take indigenous people and sort of pigeonhole us, to put us in a place and say, all right, now we know where they are. They're here at the Facilitative Working Group. And then everything that we have, all of our issues would sort of be brought through that. And yet, as you and I well know, and from all of our work, late night work there, we have very strong interest in virtually every single action taken at the UNFCCC. There's economic interest, there's all kinds of other interests that things are happening that we need to be sure that this creation that we've helped create, this Facilitative Working Group and the platform, doesn't marginalize our efforts in all these other arenas. So it's sort of a two-edged sword. We want recognition, but we also got to keep active in all these different arenas.
Thanks so much, Frank. Also, like, I really like your background. I don't know, what is it actually? What am I looking at?
You're looking at Lake Michigan, looking west from the high bluff near Alberta, Michigan, out looking over the sand dunes and the beach. And I thought it was appropriate for today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that, Frank. We have had a lot of one-on-one conversations, mainly because I was at some points leading up to the platform in a leadership position, had to deal with, like internal diplomacy, like within the caucus. With this webinar series, we've been talking about indigenous diplomacy for the last, 4.5 episodes. Like I said, you've been around, you have the mileage to know. What do you think encapsulates indigenous diplomacy?
Well, I guess that, what we talk about here in the US on this is that we talk about inherent sovereignty of indigenous peoples. And that's something that I realize that the word sovereignty is something that across the world is, you have to be really careful about how you use that in different places, but we talk about that very strongly here. And when we talk about sovereignty and that inherent sovereignty of indigenous peoples, what we're talking about is sovereignty doesn't convey wisdom. Sovereignty is the right to be as dumb as you want to be. But on the other hand, it's the responsibility to be as wise as you can be. So you need to keep those things in mind, that not every decision that we make may be wise, but we need to judge all those decisions by this metric of, are we our own worst enemy when we make this decision, or are we actually helping not only ourselves, but all of the others around us? And so, to me, that's a big part of the diplomacy. And the other thing is that having a strong self-identity, understanding who we are. You hear that in the voices of our previous speakers, a very strong cultural self-identity, understanding our not only our identity in terms of politics or discussion, but our identity in terms of place, in terms of our understanding on the earth. And so, to me, those are the guiding principles that you have to have when you're thinking about diplomacy. And then other than that, it pays to be able to know when to be tough and when to just be around and talk. And often diplomacy, there's things that happen with, when you're talking about this. And I think one of the best examples I can think of is we look at the world differently. And I remember as we were closing in on the end of the facilitative working group negotiations, and there were several of the nations in the hall that were working out the details. And we were in a room that was really quite tense. And well, we did what comes natural to us as indigenous peoples. We started singing. We had different people stood up and sang a song from different areas around the world. And, I sang a song, other people sang songs or did a little dance or did different things. And the tension in the room just sort of dissolved. And when we got done doing this, after about 30 minutes or so of this, the people in the hall came in and they'd reached a decision. Well, I believe that our singing actually helped bring that about, that it helped lower the overall tension. It helped give people something more common. So that's the kind of thing that we rely on when we're talking about diplomacy. There's many different avenues and levels of it, and we need to rely on those traditions.
Frank, I love that you brought up that particular moment, like, what is it, hour and a half maybe that we had to wait for these other countries to come back in with their decision, their yes or their no, because I think that is very significant for how a state, state indigenous partnership should be in like international negotiations and diplomacy. Just linking to that, for a lot of people, doing something like that would be considered by them as a very novel idea in terms of diplomacy. How do you consider novel ideas or tactics in a negotiations landscape like UNFCCC that has very, I would say, like stale tactics and methods?
Well, bringing that's what I just gave is a really good example of that. But there's other instances where it's important that we know how to bring in these things from our cultures, to bring in the voices of our youth, to bring in the voices of, I think about our traditions and our ancestors, and we talk about 7 generations, and we hear that a lot around that we're to plan or to think about the consequences of our actions through a time period long enough to encompass 7 generations. And that's important, but we also have to realize that each and every one of us is somebody's 7th generation. And we are today those ancestors. We're giving voice to the teachings and the things that they brought forth. And so they actually speak to us. They speak through us, but who do they speak to? They speak to those coming generations. And so we're giving voice to our ancestors and adding our voice to them for those coming generations. Well, when we have that kind of a perspective, it gives you a broader sense of what's going on. I heard this so much from Russia, and from the Sami here, and just these kind of thoughts are really critical to us in order to do this. And we bring that to the table when we come to these issues. And it's important for us to realize who we are. It's important for us to realize our strengths. And while we have strengths, we have scientists and science, and we have, the lawyers, and we have all these other people as part of us that are helping us integrate and to interface with these systems around the world. But what we have is this strength in our culture and this strength in our traditions. And we need to let that show as often as we can to help. It provides, I sometimes talk about how people are sort of willing to grant us a moral high ground when it comes to talking about respect for the earth and respect for each other. And that they just sort of assume that we're going to talk about that. And we need to remind them that is not just our responsibility, but it's everybody's.
Perfect. Frank, every time you talk, it's so eloquently and also very, very good, easy to digest that. It's always a pleasure listening. So that's why I love talking to you, mostly because I get to listen to you and ask you questions and pick your brain. Frank, maybe a little bit more about your own choices that you had to make. Have you ever come to a point in your previous roles or seen during the platform negotiations, have you ever come to a point that you had to choose between doing what's good for your people versus what's good for the entire movement? Have you ever come to that point? And if so, how did you don't have to go into details, of course, but how did you make that decision?
Well, I think often if we only take a short-term view of something, it seems fairly obvious to us that if we take a certain action that benefits us in the short term, that's better even. And often though, that short-term gain on our part may not be a gain for Indigenous people all over the place. And if you look long-term, if we make a short-term gain, it doesn't really help us that much, because it divides our interests from protecting Indigenous interests across the world. And, we talk about not throwing anybody under the bus. Well, we often want to be sure that we don't, as we take our actions, we bring everybody with us. Sometimes that's difficult, because there are things that it might be easier if we just took a different path for our own individual nation. But we have this even across the United States amongst all the tribal nations, and certainly as we consider our First Nations and all of the other Indigenous people from all over the earth. When we start broadening that and thinking about what a common issues that we all have, and dealing with colonialism and the remnants of colonialism and some of the current manifestations of it, and the problems that this has created, we have common interests, and it helps all of us when we all work together. And I think as you take that broader view, that's what helps you make those decisions. And sometimes it may hurt a little bit to make a decision that you could simply get something done really quickly for your own people, but it would not help in the long run, because you'd still have so many brothers and sisters who weren't helped at all.
Frank, there's something, I'm doing like rapid fire here a little bit, because I know there's something that you have been talking about for a very long time. Previous episodes, Johnson talked about it as well, and Graham also alluded to it, about we have, of course, within the UNFCCC, we know about the nationally determined contributions. Your idea of individual or indigenous, you can explain that in a little bit, indigenously determined contributions. For people that are watching, what is it and how can we take it to the next level or implement it?
Well, I think that what I've always tried to do is, when we take these huge issues, it's really important to boil them down to things that people can do, okay? Because there's some issues that are so big that it's an individual, it's really hard to figure out how what you're doing is going to have an impact on it. But you need to try to think it through and how you can boil that down. And so I was looking at all of the NDCs that are part of the Paris Accord, and part of all of these is a mechanism by which the nation states are working on trying to lessen greenhouse gas emissions, and their pledges of how they're going to do that. We look at that, and a lot of Indigenous peoples, and most of us, have actually put a lot of effort into guiding how those are put together. But at the same time, we talk about taking our traditional values and how we express those. And so part of that to me is that not only are there the NDCs that are out there, the nationally determined contributions, but as Indigenous nations, we need to develop our own nationally determined contributions. But that term NDC is one that's built into the mechanism of the UNFCCC, and Indigenous peoples, while we have an interest there, are not signers. So it occurred in Madrid, where the NDC morphed for Indigenous nations into an indigenously determined contribution, an IDC. And a real quick example of that is at my own tribe here, over a 10-year period, we were able and we're a small tribe, 5,000 people, and we run a medium-sized gaming operation, a casino, and our tribal operations buildings. And over a 10-year period, we were able to save 43,000 metric tons of carbon just in efficiencies by changing our light bulbs and putting in more efficient motors in our air conditioning and heating, and by doing some other things, a small amount of wind power, and by using our cooking oil, converting that into biodiesel from the kitchens to run our natural resource department vehicles. That's just us, one. And if we take these IDCs, that is indigenous people from all over the world, and this can be done in places where there's quite a lot of development, but if your development consists of a few electric lights and some generators, just making sure that those are LEDs and that they work, you can have a major effect on how much you're going to change. So by adding these indigenously determined contributions together, aggregating them for the next COP, which is several months now further down the road, but that gives us more time to organize this. We can show up and be demonstrating not only that we want the nations of the world to meet their pledges and to do their work, but we can show what work we're doing, and we can show what kind of things we're doing. So I think that IDC is really important. And I carried that just a little further to a PDC, a personally determined contribution. And this, for instance, is for those who are able to take the stairs instead of the elevator. We checked our elevator use. We sort of made it a common thing that people were discouraged from using the elevator at our casino, our employees, and they were encouraged to use the stairs. Well, not only are they healthier after a couple years of doing this, but we saved something like 56% of the electricity that runs that elevator was saved because we didn't have to buy it. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that was not generated that using fossil fuels. So these kind of things, these PDCs, what can an individual do at home or in the kind of actions that they can take. And so I wanted to have it be down to a personal level, but also an indigenous nation level. And that's the goal of this process.
Thanks, thanks, Frank. So yeah, let's give that some meat, like throughout, before COP, so start developing those IDCs and PDCs, of course. So many acronyms and abbreviations, but definitely want to add this one to our repertoire. Tomo, you have a final question for Frank? You're on mute, my friend.
Hi, Frank.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being with us today. I have more like bigger questions, well, not bigger, if not, maybe it's a larger, put in larger context about what is going on in the United States and around the world, for example, exemplified by a movement like Black Lives Matter. And now I think that people around the world are sparking discussions globally regarding racial injustice and inequality. And to an extent, people from majority societies are also becoming more vulnerable or wanting to engage with people in the minority or even their own history, engage their own identity to come to terms with where they're from and who they are. I just wanted to kind of ask your view on, what are these people doing right? What are they doing right, and what are they doing wrong? And what do you want to see more of in the context of this global discussion surrounding racial injustice and inequality?
Well, I think I can talk about a couple things, but I don't think I'm really here to speak what they're doing wrong, for instance.
Right.
I think that's not for me to say. But what I can talk about is that this is in many ways, this is the This is another of those manifestations of the impacts of colonialism, and that as we try to decolonize our minds overall, all of us, indigenous peoples and people of color in general all over the world, we have, there's what's happened with the Black Lives Matter movement has been something that this movement was there all along. It's been there. It's been part of what we've had to, what we've wanted to get out. But we've had this unfortunate incidents lately that have helped trigger this movement. The biggest issue, I think, with the movement, with what's going on around the movement, is to maintain the focus. That once you get something moving, there's so many people want to take advantage of this movement to try to get some other things done that may not be part of the original message. That it's hard overall to maintain that focus, and I think that's one of the challenges with this. It's also, there are people who are consciously trying to sabotage this in various ways. And I think it's important to maintain that long-term focus. I think as an example of struggles like this, in the UN work that we've had, one of the countries that has been quite helpful on several occasions when we've needed to work has been South Africa. And in meetings with them, we were meeting with a number of leaders in New York at the UN, and one of the things they reminded us is that when they were young, they were part of the anti-apartheid movement, and they came to the United States and traveled and sought assistance and help, and they received a lot of help from indigenous peoples, from the native peoples here. So when we show up asking for help from them, they remember that, and they're willing to help us. And they're willing to help organize meetings and do different things and help us work. They're not necessarily always in agreement with us, but they're willing to help us work. And it's that kind of thing that we're building here, is that we're all in this to help each other. We all have, there's a common root in the problems that exist, and we need to be supportive. I think all people of color need to be aware of the issues that are going on, and I'm really pleased by this movement. I'm pleased by the fact that this is creating a political atmosphere in which many things are happening that might not otherwise have happened right away. I think of one example here in the U.S. We've been fighting mascot issues on indigenous peoples. And the Washington Redskins football team has dropped their name and is now just the Washington football team. And we've been fighting for 30 years to get rid of this terrible slander on indigenous peoples. Well, I don't think that would have happened without the support of the Black Lives Matter issues and with the Black players that were there and others. And it this whole Black Lives Matters movement helped create an atmosphere in which a lot of things are happening that are really positive. And I'm hopeful that out of this chaos there'll be some things that come that are very good. Someone showed me an article here a while back about someone who was complaining about the lawlessness of everything that's going on and how terrible everything was, and talking and I analyzed what was being said, and while it was well written and well reasoned, but I realized that this person, if they were writing in 1776, the time of the revolution here in the US, they would have been on the side of the king, not the patriots that were fighting that helped create the United States. And so their condemnation of people who violate law and order, in other words, people who do civil disobedience, they don't think about the fact that the very roots of the freedom within which they speak are rooted in civil disobedience that occurred that actually went to revolution when the United States, was created after the Revolutionary War fighting the British. So these kind of changes, we have to keep that broad historical perspective as we look at these things. And in that perspective, this Black Lives Matters movement is one of the major change elements, I think, of this century. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. I assume that it was the last question. Thank you very much, Frank, once again for joining us. And I really hope to see you around in the next meeting, wherever that might be. And we can continue on our conversation as always. So thank you very much, Frank. And then we will move on to the next speaker.